Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a Creating the Perfect Book challenge. I saw this on Daniel Green's channel and I saw this on Murphy Napier's channel, so I thought I'd give it a go. I actually specifically haven't been tagged, but it's fantasy, so I was gonna do it anyway. This has a bunch of prompts and you've got to match essentially authors that you enjoyed the execution of that prompt to create the perfect book. The explanation is a bit shoddy, so I'm just going to jump into actually doing the challenges and you'll catch up as I talk about the stuff that I like in books. The first thing on this list is tone. So naturally when I thought about tone of books, I thought about atmosphere, and I think that Becky Chambers does that really well in all of her Wayfarer books, but also in her novella To Be Taught If Fortunate. She also has a new series coming out in 2021, and the way that these books make me feel and the way that they just set up their characterization through the tone and the world building in her books, it's hard to describe, but I just love the way that she's so empathetic and so inclusive and her books are just so heartfelt. So Becky Chambers is definitely somebody who, when you say tone, I think of pretty much immediately. The next prompt on here is character, and I really struggled with this. I have 3, so I need to actually narrow it down. The first one is Joe Abercrombie, and he just writes characters so well. I think I said that in my reading vlog when I was reading his newest book, The Trouble with Peace, and he writes character so intentionally, so I might end up choosing him, but my other 2 are Robin Hobb and then also Sebastian de Castell. I think Sebastian de Castell could be for something else and Robin Hobb maybe for something else, because even though I still remember her characters after reading her books so long ago, they stuck with me so strongly. I think Joe Abercrombie is going to win when it comes to characterization. I actually have a Joe Abercrombie book, so I should hold that up. He really makes you understand the scope of his characters in a few sentences, and he also makes them quite funny at times as well. He puts humor in and that makes them more human. So I think Joe Abercrombie is a win when it comes to characters, because when I pick up a book by him, I don't necessarily remember the depth of the world building, even though it's definitely there and built up. I remember it through the context of his characters and the lens of his characters. So this is going to have to win when it comes to characters for me. Next we have magic system, and I'm trying to hold off on saying Sanderson, so instead I'm going to say Dresden. The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher have Harry Dresden at the centre of them. He is a PI and he works on a contract basis for the police in this world because obviously he's a wizard, it's an urban fantasy and there are supernatural murders and that kind of thing, but I love the way that each supernatural nasty in this series has a variation. So in the second book, Full Moon, there were werewolves, but it wasn't just one kind of werewolf, there were a bunch of different kinds, and it went into the lore and explained why there were different kinds and why people would become werewolves, and it situated you in his world building that way, and it gave it context and I loved it. And then later on in the books there is vampires introduced and there are multiple courts of vampires with different politics and stuff, and usually I wouldn't be as interested in the mechanisms of politics, but the way that it's done, it centers characters and it centers you through the understanding piece by piece of these different kinds of vampires and Dresden's interactions with them. And I think that that, combined with the way that Dresden knows magic and understands magic, there are very strict rules, but he still surprises you by using them and subverting them sometimes, and the capacity of his strength sometimes surprises you too. So I would definitely say Dresden for this, even though I really wanted to say Sanderson. The next one is villains, and this is another one that I had to struggle not to say Joe Abercrombie for, because essentially everyone in his work can be a villain depending on the lens you're looking at them through, but I think that's the way he did character. He wrote them so well that they can be so convincing either way. So for villains, I'm actually going to go with the Lightbringer books by Brent Weeks, and I only say this because there was a character introduced, I think maybe in the 3rd book. He's more entrenched later on when it comes to the politics and the assassin and underworkings of the courts, so I don't want to talk about him too much. I don't actually remember his name because I read them on audiobook, and when I read them on audiobook sometimes secondary characters' names just fall out of my head. But he had such a distinct trait to his character that made him so unpredictable and terrifying. And he wasn't a stupid villain either, he wouldn't monologue, and so that made him extra terrifying, because how are you supposed to get around a villain that doesn't conform to specific tropes of being villainous? I loved that. And I also loved another character, Andros Guile. He is amazing and he's very political, so I didn't think I would love him that much. But because you get a perspective from him, you get to see the inner workings of his thoughts and the way he does things, it makes you understand him, and I loved that. Next is the hero, and this is the question that I saved Brandon Sanderson for, even though I could have easily put him into another one, specifically world building. I put him into the hero because Kaladin in this series is the epitome of the hero. He has such strong character moments and arcs, especially through the first book and through the second, and I think everybody who I've encountered really likes Kaladin. He's set up to be the favourite character in this series, and he's done in a very humanising, heroic way. And I think Brandon consistently writes heroic characters that are good, because he did that with Vin as well, and he's done that with a few other characters. So I think heroes in Brandon Sanderson's work are quite prevalent. You wouldn't read a Brandon Sanderson book and expect the morality of Joe Abercrombie's characters. You read Brandon's characters because they always have hope, and you read Brandon's characters because they will likely do the good thing, even if it's the harder thing to do. Whereas in Joe Abercrombie, for example, if the harder thing to do is the better thing, the character will be like, it's a bit too difficult for me, so I'm out. I think Brandon takes away the cake for the hero's question. Mostly also because I love Kaladin so much. Next on this list is action, and I already have 3 authors on here, but they're already authors I've mentioned. So Dresden is one, Sanderson is another, and Abercrombie is the third one. But I really think I should pick something else. And so I think even though all of them are spectacular at talking about action, I might have to go with Sebastian de Castell instead, because I love the way that in Spellslinger he talks about the jewels. If you don't know this series, it's a young adult fantasy series. It's pretty much one of my favourite young adult series of all time, and it follows Kellen, and he is a mage, or a training mage, and in the village that he's in they have to spark their bands in order to progress magically, and Kellen is really having trouble sparking his bands, and he knows all the somatic shapes that you're supposed to shape your hands into. He knows all of the concepts behind magic. The only thing that's holding him back is the fact that he can't spark his bands. So because of that, he's a little bit stunted compared to all of the others in his class, and the way that he's brought up is very manipulative and in a culture that values power. So the people that he's surrounded by often take out any frustrations or any machinations that they don't like upon Kellen, so he has to figure out how to bluff his way through situations. So I love the way that he bluffs his way through situations, he acts in situations, and he surprises you. And I think the way that these things are described are very clear to me. So I think I'm gonna have to say that de Castell is my favourite for action. Even though other authors obviously have pulled action off perfectly, I would say that Castell is a pretty close contender. Next is battles, and again, this kind of ties into action, but I want to say Brandon Sanderson again, because the way that battles are described, especially in the second book in the Stormlight Archive, and also there's an action scene earlier on in the second book, he just wrote it so well. And I want to also say Joe Abercrombie, because he writes battles really well, but sometimes it gets a little bit long-winded and I do a bit of a disconnect. So Brandon really sticks with his characters, whereas Joe Abercrombie flitted around characters. So depending on my mood, I could pick one or the other, but I really don't know who else I could choose. Maybe Percy Jackson, because I like the way that all of those battles involve magic and mythology and magical creatures. So just to be a bit different and not say authors I've already said, I'm gonna go with Percy Jackson. Then we have plot, and for this one I had Spellslinger, which I've already said, but I might have to go with de Castell's other book, Traitor's Blade, because honestly I don't know how to describe the plot to you in that book, but I know that I cared. And that is the beauty of de Castell's writing. He puts you into Falkio's perspective, and Falkio is a lawmaker, he's a greatcoat, and he used to work for the king, so did his friends Kest and Brasti, but a few years ago the dukes of the realm conspired to murder this king, and this king stood for justice, and so now Falkio and his fellow greatcoats are set out in the world. They don't really have a purpose, so their purpose is to find meaning, their purpose is to incite justice, and they're kind of struggling doing that, and they've become sellswords, and they stumble into a plot almost by accident. And so I love that it's swashbuckling, I love that it is informed by character, and I love that the plot made me care about what was happening, and it expanded the world building very slowly. So I think I'll have to go with De Castell for plot for his Greatcoats series. Do I though? I've already said he has books for an answer, but I honestly can't think of anything else. I think I'm just gonna have to stick to it. Mostly because these are some of my favorite books ever. So I wanted to put them in this video somewhere. Next is world building, and I was going to say Sanderson for this one, but I did not. I'm going to say instead The Wheel of Time, and I've only read the first book in this, and so I can't speak to the rest of the series, but I know it expands so much. So The Eye of the World, the first book, the way that it developed the world as I was reading it, it was enough to form like a net of understanding underneath the characters that I was reading about. I didn't have questions, and it fed me details enough that it wasn't an info dump kind of scenario. Towards the end, it felt a little bit rushed in a certain aspect. I did a reading vlog if you're interested, but it has spoilers in it, so watch at your own risk if you haven't read book one, because I spoiled the entire thing. But that explains my thoughts about the ending. I can't really say anything here because this is a spoiler-free video, but the way that Robert Jordan built the world, I only have more questions, and I have not been slaked with my thirst for understanding this world. So that is why I'm continuing. I have book 2, and I will continue that in early 2021, but he built the world so well that I am so intrigued. So aside from Sanderson, definitely Robert Jordan. And it makes sense that Sanderson finished the Wheel of Time series. Next up is romance, and I actually wanted to put Becky Chambers in only because her romances are so soft and wholesome, and they're inclusive, and they have brilliant representation. But I used her at the beginning of this question challenge video thing, so I can't use her again really, can I? So I've also used, have I used V.E. Schwab? Because I want to use her because I loved The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. That is her newest book, and it's become one of my favorites of all time. Probably my favorite of 2020, except my rereads, because I reread Stormlight and I love that series. So it's my favorite newly read book in 2020. And I love how it investigated romance. So it is pitched in a sense that misaligns you with what the story's about. It's not about a girl named Addie who is in love with the devil. It's not about that at all. Addie is a girl who is 300 years old, but she didn't intend to have immortality when she first made this deal with the devil. She just wanted freedom, and she was in 1700s France. She was being put into a marriage that she didn't want to be part of, and so she was like, I want out, I don't want to do this. Sorry, I got a phone call, but what was I talking about? Addie. And the devil curses her because he's the devil, so he ends up granting her immortality, but also curses her with the fact that nobody remembers her and she can't write her own name. So she is trying to investigate the boundaries of this curse. She's investigating art, and she really discovers her identity through being so isolated from everybody. And she ends up running one day into this boy in a secondhand bookstore named Henry, and this is in 2014, so this has been like 300 years. And for some reason, Henry remembers her. So that is the premise of the book. Why does he remember her? And it doesn't necessarily investigate her romance with the devil, it investigates a relationship with Henry. So that's why I love romance here, because it's complicated, it's messy, it's new, and it's interesting, and I love the way that V.E. Schwab did it in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's a bit different to the way she wrote stuff in her previous books. It's a bit of a different flavour, but it's still distinctly V.E. Schwab, so I really enjoyed it. So I'm putting romance as V.E. Schwab together in this challenge. And then lastly, we have prose. And I think this one is going to be a pretty obvious answer, but I don't talk about it that much on my channel, but it is pretty obvious that I love it because I have multiple copies on my shelf of this book, and it's The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Everyone talks about Patrick Rothfuss and prose, so this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. I found his writing lyrical and captivating, even though the first 50 pages of this book don't necessarily put you into Quoth's story. They just capture your attention. So we follow Quoth. He is an innkeeper at the moment, and we're in present day, and a chronicler comes into his inn. A bunch of other stuff happens as well, but a chronicler comes into his inn and says, "Are you the legendary Quoth?" And Quoth ends up telling the chronicler his life story and the magics that he learned and the quests that he went on. But obviously, because it's told through his perspective, I'm sure he embellishes a lot of stuff. So he's not an entirely reliable narrator, but I still love this story anyway. And it involves a magical university, and it has a few different kinds of magic system in it. One that is able to be tracked and learned because there's a university. Obviously it teaches magic, so you have to be able to learn it. It's more close to alchemy. And then there's another magic that is more like the essence of things. And Quoth sees this magic used very early on in his childhood because he's with a traveling troupe, and this man joins the troop for a little while, and he literally calls the name of the wind. So that is what Quoth is in an investigation to discover how to use this kind of magic. And there you go. That is it for this video challenge. I think I have a pretty eclectic mix of fantasy books, but a lot of them are by my favorite authors, so that kind of just makes sense. Let me know if you can think of anything to do with your favorites of each category, like tone, character, world building. I'd be interested to know. But thank you so much for watching this video. I'll chat to you down in the comments, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.